Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today on the podcast, we're going to talk about revolution. This was a topic that was recently suggested by a listener and a friend of the podcast, so thank you for that. It's an excellent thing for us to be discussing. Obviously, it's something that we see in the outer world around us. It's been important throughout history. There have been obviously significant revolutions at various points and in various countries. And we can also have inner psychic revolutions. So what is the nature of revolution, either inner or outer? How do the two things relate? How can we understand this important force for sudden change in the world and in the psyche?
Well, it seems to me that as a broad brush characteristic of revolution, that it is perceived as a relatively sudden change, that it comes, it seems, out of nowhere. And we see it, of course, in overthrows of political regimes and social protests and all kinds of things that are suddenly in full view. And usually, of course, it's related to a perceived injustice, perceived oppression, a perceived refusal on the part of the revolutionaries to have their concerns and causes considered by those in authority. And I often think of it as, I think the concept of the tipping point has been useful, at least to me, as a little sort of inner image for revolution. It's as if people have been climbing a mountain and climbing a mountain and climbing a mountain, and nobody sees it and nobody hears, and they keep saying, wow, this is really hard. We're really suffering. It's getting cold. The terrain is rocky. We're having a hard time. And then there is the peak and a tipping point, and all of a sudden people are on the other side as a seeming sort of informal mass mobilization. Or it may be the place of an individual, but you're on the other side of it, and it seems sudden, but there has been a long run-up to the tipping point of the actual outburst or revolution.
Jung had a lot to say about tipping points and revolution. He was very interested in mass psychology. And so while he advocated for a kind of internal revolution, which every person was destined to have at midlife, a kind of overthrowing of the dominant paradigms of the first half of life, our youthful beliefs, those things needed to be overthrown in order to create a new internal order that was more aligned with the emergent qualities of the self. He was deeply concerned about outer revolutions and the destructive, frightening consequences of destabilizing a national order. And of course, he was looking at World War I and, in a great state of horror, World War II, which erupted all around him. He wanted to understand and, I think, perhaps provide some kind of resilience to people so that these terrible things might not happen again. In his writings, he moves back and forth between some sense of confidence that this could be understood in the right way, and then some pessimism about whether or not humanity could evolve quickly enough to avoid catastrophe. He was also very concerned about the emergence of atomic weapons. Historically, a revolution might be contained within one culture, like the French Revolution, but the thought that nation states now could inflict a revolutionary demand upon the entire world really frightened him. And he had catastrophic images that haunted him throughout his life, and more intensely towards the end. So I think we're all holding this paradox that we do need a kind of overthrow of things that do not work or somehow stand against life's evolution. And the over-concretization of that process can discount human suffering and loss of life if it is externalized too concretely. And we see evidence of all of these things.
You know, Joseph, your statement about the inner revolution that needs to come at midlife made me think of the alchemical image of the killing of the old king. Mm-hmm. So there's this beautiful illustration in the Solar Splendus where the old king is being killed, which actually maps onto ancient practices in some cultures where the king was ritually sacrificed. And that was in order to provide some renewal to the culture. So the sense that a revolution is a renewal and a necessary one in the inner psychic landscape that can overturn old ways of being. And it can be in someone's life. It can feel very destructive. It might mean the end or a dramatic change in a longstanding relationship. It might mean, picking up and moving or having a new career or perhaps even just, and this can be quite fundamental, developing a different attitude toward life. Mm-hmm. But I did want to also tack on to the second part of your statement, Joseph, this important quote from Jung that I think summarizes a lot of what you were saying. He said, "The gigantic catastrophes that threaten us today are not elemental happenings of a physical or biological order, but psychic events. To a quite terrifying degree, we are threatened by wars and revolutions, which are nothing other than psychic epidemics." So he was really mistrustful of revolutions in the outer world. As we've seen before, I think because of the events that he witnessed in the 20th century, he was very frightened by mass psychology, and revolutions are undoubtedly an example of that.
It's such a real illustration of the difference between cultural and mass movements, psychology, and dynamics, and what we can claim as individuals, that the culture moves more slowly. The culture goes down to more elemental kinds of principles and concretizations. And the hope here, it seems to me, implicit in this, is that we, whether we're going from the first to the second stage of life or faced with some other life challenge and change, that we can embrace it internally and make the change so that we don't have to have a kind of internal armed rebellion, such as we do see culturally around the world historically and in some of the protests going on today. We could anticipate this and allow evolution instead of revolution.
Well, I think that that's substantial, Deb, what you just said, evolution versus revolution. The other thing I want to say about the word revolution is, it's the word revolve. Revolution is a kind of revolving door. We're kind of circling and repeating something with the revolution of ideas, the spinning or rounding of things that eventually become the thing that they claimed to overthrow.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So evolution is a way of imagining that we could establish a new platform rather than just some kind of iterative cycle or repetition compulsion. So I'm going to share a slightly lengthy quote from Jung because it seems so relevant to how we lose track of significant psychological realities, which then go underground and foment a kind of destruction of a culture, versus what you were saying, Deb, staying alert and artful and creative, where we might reimagine a culture and evolve to something. So Jung writes, "Only in the age of enlightenment did people discover that the gods did not really exist, but were simply projections. Thus, the gods were disposed of, but the corresponding psychological function was by no means disposed of. It lapsed into the unconscious, and people were thereupon poisoned by the surplus of libido that had once been laid up in the culture of divine images." So I want to stay just with that first idea, and there's other ones that I think are important. There's a couple of things that we can trace. For instance, in certain sects of Islam, there has been a powerful directive to destroy all images of deity, taking over a land and defacing the various images of Buddha or other gods that have been carved into the mountainside and blowing them to smithereens, or imprisoning or severely punishing people who would dare to create some kind of image of the divine, which then limits people to trying to express feeling through abstract geometric forms, which is a form of art that is permissible in Islamic cultures. What Jung is saying is that an attack on the God image does something to the human psyche which makes it unwell, that we need creative ways to imagine the divine and to anthropomorphize it in many ways, although not exclusively, because we need ways to capture these wild, archetypal, primal forces, and perhaps in ritualized ways, as religion does, to then be in relationship to the image itself. And any time we destroy images that are central to the psychic functioning of the individual and the community, those forces go somewhere and often act out collectively and individually in ways that can be terrifying. So we see this to some degrees in the Protestant Revolution, that for many reasons which one could justify, the Catholic Church had become corrupt in a number of ways, was exercising an enormous amount of political power that was not appropriate for it, as well as assuming all kinds of resources. But one of the things that the Catholic Church was rich in was religious imagery, which was central to the sublimation of various unconscious aggressions, violence, other kinds of antisocial energies which are in all of us. When the Protestants deconstructed Catholicism under the guise of returning to this pure, non-imagistic form of Christianity, there was and continues to be a rise in unconscious mass infections, that our more savage impulses are less contained, even by Christianity, when it moved from an imagistic process to an intellectual process. So we need images, and any assaults on images or grotesque devaluation of important cultural images does something to us, and we become poisoned, as Jung says, poisoned by the surplus of libido that had once been laid up in the cult of divine images.
So what you're saying is so important, it seems to me, that these images, these archetypal images, are kind of conduits for libido. And without those, the libido sort of sluices over the whole landscape. And it's interesting because I think that attacks on cultural images are often a part of revolution. More on that in just a second. And also that kind of freeing up of libido in this completely chaotic way can create revolutionary fervor. So there's maybe a bit of a feedback loop there. I'm thinking about the vehemence of the attacks on priests and kings during the French Revolution. And one way to look at that is that those, obviously those were corrupt institutions, but those are also images, and they are metaphors for things of transpersonal value that were attacked vehemently. So there's also this way that I'm thinking about revolutionary fervor often has a kind of egoic aspect as well, that in many, perhaps not all, but in many revolutions that I'm thinking of, there's been a sense of what exists is a problem, and so I'm going to tear it down, and then it will be replaced with something that is a kind of a product of the conscious mind, that we can think of a better world order than the one that evolved before. And I think that sort of conscious, egoic stance tends to devalue those archetypal images and that sort of non-rational side of things, therefore becoming really unmoored and ungrounded and kind of uprooted.
Really, I think you're pointing to hubris, a kind of inflation that can take over, especially you use the example of the French Revolution of we will overthrow the corrupt regime, or the Protestant Revolution. And we have conceived in our minds, our egos, a better way of doing governance or religion or whatever the project is. But it is also really so susceptible to corruption itself, because that is the nature of ego. When ego feels that it can grab hold of primal archetypal energies and shape them according to ego's desires, we have really overreached. I think about the myth of Icarus, where he had his wings that were glued onto his arms with wax, and he flew too high. And if we arrogate to ego what truly belongs to the depth of psyche, to the divine, we are headed for trouble. And we've seen that over and over and over again.
But it needs saying that there's at least one example of revolution that comes very easily to mind.
Okay.
Where there was a new order that was very intentionally and consciously created, not very far from where I sit today. And it's worked out pretty well.
Aha, the American Revolution.
Yes.
As Lisa sits in Philadelphia.
Philadelphia, where the Congressional Congress met to draft the new Constitution, which so far is holding on. And I think it's really interesting, though, like what about that allowed it to happen, there was a revolution, there was an overthrowing of the old order, and then a new order was put in place, again, very kind of consciously, with lots of ego strength from people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. And why did that work? And I would say, this is probably a pretty superficial, quick shooting from the hip take. But firstly, there was a real understanding of the transpersonal basis upon which this new government that they made was being formed. There was a sense that, all men are created equal. I would say all women too. And that is a kind of a spiritual statement. It is a statement about the nature of the cosmos and our relationship with God, as it were. And also, there was a lot of hubris in that room. They had an understanding, the framers of the Constitution, I think, had an understanding of the weaknesses of human nature and tried to build that into our democratic process. Again, it works imperfectly, and we've really seen that in recent years, but it is still working.
So in a way, what I'm thinking about here is that the American Revolution was the overthrow of an idea, which is top-down authority, and the authority rests in a king, and that it was a giving over of power to individuals, that we could be self-determining, one man, one vote. And of course, this was very imperfect. There were lots of people who didn't have the vote by any means. But it was an idea of grassroots power instead of hierarchical power.
But it's interesting because those were the same principles that influenced the French Revolution, but things went really differently.
Well, I think that there's so, and I claim to be a historian,
right?
But there's so many differences, I suspect.
We're playing fast and loose here, folks.
But I want to, we are. We're sitting here with our coffee cups, unraveling the mysteries of the world and the universe. There's a big difference, though, between the mantra that I hear way too often currently, which is tear it all down.
Yes.
Which is a very different fantasy. That is an apocalyptic fantasy, which is liberation from matter, liberation from the body, that we will simply remove everything, which of course is everything that supports your survival, your ability to avoid suffering, or all kinds of systems that we are dependent upon for civil society and personal survival. Burn it all down. Now, when I confront somebody about that, then they pedal backwards and they're like, well, I don't mean all down. It's like, I want to keep my house, and, I like this, and the supermarket, and I'm not going to give up my car, although I would like it to be electric. But what we hear from the collective, which is more dangerous, is there something infective about the idea of tear it all down, this indiscriminate burning everything down to the ground, and a fantasy which we see in the book of Revelation, that a magical city will descend down from on high, the New Jerusalem, that nobody has to do anything, that it just floats down from the sky, and the Lamb is at the center, illuminating all things. So there is a dangerous fantasy about tearing it all down. And during the American Revolution, differently, it was a liberation from the king. That we are removing a singular influence that we have come to believe is blighting us in one way or another, impairing us. So it's the difference between, for instance, you have an illness in your body. You take a medicine that attacks specifically the virus. I came down with COVID several months ago, and I took a Paxlovid, which is a targeted antiviral that goes after that particular pathogen, and hopefully it doesn't damage other parts of the system. So the single pathogen is removed so that a kind of homeostatic thriving could happen in the body. And I think the removal of the king and its influences from England was part of that targeted medicine, which is quite different from tearing it all down in an apocalyptic fantasy.
Well, one element around revolution that we haven't touched on, but your comments really give rise to this, is the feeling of fury on the part of a populace. And we are seeing that now in Iran with women in the streets. We are seeing it in China. People are in the streets protesting censorship and COVID lockdowns. That there is a lot of heat here that is, yes, connected to a concept, but emotional fueling is a huge part of this. That when one part of the collective psyche or an individual psyche has been oppressed and repressed, eventually, like a volcano, there will be these eruptions. It seems to be just a kind of a psychic compensation to restore a kind of balance in the collective psyche.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to your earlier point, Deb, about the tipping point, that it is a reaction to something.
Jung has another quote. I'm taking slightly out of context, but I think it's relevant particularly to the Chinese uprising at the moment. And he says, or writes, "The individual's feeling of weakness, indeed of non-existence, was thus compensated by the eruption of hitherto unknown desires for power." So all things are being compensated in these pairs of opposites. So for the Chinese populace, where so much is over-controlled by the government, and punishment for deviation can be really frightening, part of what that does in those who are legitimately powerless or feel powerless is that their power complex goes unconscious, and then it rises up in the collective as a mass movement attempt to regain power. He is describing it in his energic view of the psyche, where life force moves around both in the individual and in the culture, and things that are not permitted to be expressed in the culture go into a kind of volcanic aquifer.
Yes, exactly. Which ties in very much on a cultural level to the urge to individuation. That psyche is going somewhere. It is going somewhere culturally. It goes somewhere in families, goes somewhere in any kind of collective or group, just as it does in individuals. And trying to repress or oppress that or govern it away simply doesn't work. And that also calls up the great opposite of power, which is eros. And where power is, love is not. And we see that culturally, where people, or one part of a population, where people are oppressed. Things are not perceived as fair. Things are not perceived as caring. And hence, we have the heat and fire and the volcanic force of a revolution.
And one example of that in America was the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s. And why we even have coined the term revolution is that leading up to the 1960s, there was an enormous, repressive, and increasingly intense imposition of a kind of purity fantasy, particularly driven by the Protestant potency that was rising in the United States, taking hold of human sexuality, limiting it, and become increasingly punitive towards anyone who deviated from sex for procreation, sex without contraception, because if you had contraception, then you'd be having sex for carnal reasons rather than simply being fruitful and multiplying, and on and on and on. And this massive punishment of any kind of sexual behavior that was not procreative. So all of that natural sexuality, Pan, the god of sex in the Greco-Roman system, doesn't die. He's under the ground, and he's fomenting a collective revolution. And then finally in the 1960s, the collective psyche in the United States and in Western Europe, by the way, also, there is an explosion and a rejection of the oppression. The tragic part of that is because the oppressors were associated with the dominant religious institutions, that becoming or restoring an instinctive and natural sexuality went to war with the religious institutions that provided images that contain archetypal forces. So, in depotentiating our religious institutions, we then, in another kind of cycle, allowed an enormous amount of archetypal energy to go back into the unconscious, which is more of that Apollonic ordering principle. And so now we're seeing in our times, not just in the United States, but actually globally, this eruption of a kind of religious impulse to order and contain. And we're swinging between these opposites, this kind of wild Pan-like sexuality, and then this repression of any sense of considered orderliness, even within sexuality. And now this eruption of oppressive, legislatively driven attack on sexuality. And we're going to continue moving between these wild opposites until human beings can hold a conscious relationship to both and internalize the war between order and disorder within themselves, not just in the realm of sexuality, but in all the realms where we have both instinctive and intellectual goals.
Joseph, you have said a lot there, and using sexuality as an example, but by far not the only one, of how wild and disparate polarities everywhere have become. That we do see a lot of autocratic regimes springing up as a way to contain and order in some parts of the world. And that is very much opposed by, people conducting mass protests or just individuals saying, I will do what I want. I determine my values, can't restrain me or contain me. So we've gone from containers to polarities. And that, it seems to me, is a huge dynamic going on worldwide. And the challenge, of course, as you also said, is how do we do this job for ourselves and in ourselves, of managing the urge to individuation on the one hand and the need for containment and order and a responsible process that is conscious on the other hand.
I think that's really well said, Deb. And, I like that we've sort of broken it into these two kind of fundamental energies, the one that wants to become liberated and freed of all bounds, maybe like Dionysus, and then the ordering principle like Apollo, and that both are in us and out in the world, and both matter. And Joseph, I'm really liking what you did a little while ago when we were talking about the American Revolution, and it seems to me that one of the ways to say that is that those in charge had an understanding of the importance of both the liberatory urge and the ordering urge, and that they were held in about the right balance. I'm also thinking back, Joseph, to what you said a bit ago about the urge to tear it all down, to burn it all down, this sort of indiscriminate destructiveness that can come with a revolutionary urge. And of course, what you said about the Book of Revelations, that's exactly what Lenin taught, is that we're going to burn it all down, and then magically this new order will appear. It will just be kind of gifted to us. The state will wither away, and there will be this kind of utopia. Somehow revolution is connected, I think, with that idea of utopia. And so it feels like the end justifies any means. That because what's on the other side of this is kind of some sort of earthly perfection, that it doesn't matter how destructive it is. The etymology of these two words, evolve, comes from the Latin for to unroll, whereas revolution comes from the Latin to roll back, which is super interesting because we think of revolutions as moving things forward. But in some sense, it is a kind of going back, or maybe a desire to go back to something that's really fundamental.
And Jung gives us a formula, a way out, which is no small thing, but he is very specific about it. And he writes, again, another quote, "The point is not conversion into the opposite, but conservation of the previous values together with recognition of their opposites," which goes to what you were saying, Deb, of evolution.
Yes.
So I'm going to say that because this is, I think, a hugely useful thing. The point is not conversion into the opposite, but conservation of the previous values together with recognition of their opposites. So, for instance, we've seen this with the current Pope. He's not saying, let's burn down the Vatican and whatever thousands of years of tradition. But he said, what we need to add to Catholicism is a respect and appreciation for the dignity and autonomy of the LGBT community and their right to form unions. That is something that would be acknowledged and held within the existing structure. And that's also a way that we personally can evolve, that we can still honor and retain the values that are important to us, that perhaps we were raised with or learned in one way or another, or we've acquired over our lives, that when we come to someone who is either living or espousing a philosophy very different from us, our job is to recognize their experience, to be curious about this other way of thinking and being, to not destroy it or to adopt it, but to have a relationship to it, and to create a space where people can self-declare.
So you're speaking so psychologically to, what happens in a therapy process in an analytic consulting room. How do we, whether it's on a cultural or an individual level, how do we include and honor all parts, whether it's women or some other minority in a culture? How do we include them? How do we care about them? How do we get curious about them? How do we care about what it is that they truly legitimately need and consider that? And that is what happens in the consulting room of what about those parts of yourself that have been put into shadow, that have been deemed unworthy or simply have not been recognized. How do we call them forth and talk to them and include them? And therefore, hopefully, the individual will be more whole.
So Jung famously said, when he really fell into the unconscious, that he made a deal with these parts of himself. And he said, I will listen to anything you have to say, but I will reserve the right to decide what is right for me and what is actionable for me, but I won't suppress the dialogue, and consequently, he would not try to suppress the dialogue with other people as well, which reportedly created this strange and supernatural experience that people reported just being near Jung, particularly later in life. Just sitting silently next to him, people would say that they actually felt more free, just being in his presence. But not because he agreed with everything, or wanted to join them with whatever they wanted, but because this desire to oppress out of fear had really been changed in him.
I think I want to lift up maybe a complementary process to the one the two of you have just been talking about sort of letting in those parts of ourselves that haven't had a seat at the table. I think at some point in adulthood, we have to go back and come to terms with the legacy of the father. And I mean, it might be the personal father, but I'm thinking it's also the culture, just what we have been bequeathed in terms of attitudes and traditions. And one answer is to burn it all down, but an answer that conserves something is more like a process of discernment. So we go through all of those things that we've been bequeathed by the culture, by the cultural father, by the personal father, by history and tradition, and we say, this is of value, and I want to keep this. This no longer serves me, and I want to get rid of it. So that's another answer, another way out of this burn it all down dilemma, while still recognizing the importance of having to welcome change.
And that attitude requires a capacity to tolerate conflict and self-division within ourselves, which we want to shrink away from. It takes a lot of energy to hold our ambivalent attitudes about everything, frankly. We think we're very deterministic, or we like to think of ourselves, but truthfully, when we're quiet and relaxed enough, we're constantly debating inside between the different positions. So we do want to retreat philosophically and even morally from these internal conflicts. But what we're trying to resist, as I said, is converting radically and destructively into just the opposite opinion, or convulsively stiffening up into the previous attitude, which is part of what we are certainly seeing in American culture, that we really haven't figured out how to create a true amalgam of the innumerable ideas and cultures, religions, stances that constitute the great kind of mixing bowl of American culture. We're so diverse, it's such a geographically enormous area. So we have a tendency to want to swing into various dominances. Right now, the idea of the stiffening of the senex, that these very traditional interpretations of our values are kind of trying to become more rigid, more narrow-minded, more standoffish, more unpleasant. This inflexible, violent resurgence of control is a way that we resist the internal conflict of creating an amalgam where remarkably different people can all live in the same town with goodwill. And so our capacities fall into the unconscious, and of course then we get swept away.
It seems to me that this stiffening, I really like that, the word you picked, Joseph, into these inflexible, rigid structures, really constitute a defense against the anxiety that comes with change or the challenge of a different group who have different values, come from a different culture, 100 different things. We want the security of a kind of sameness and structures and rules and, quote, the way things should be, unquote. So we get anxious when things are not clear, when things are ambiguous and we don't know in ourselves, for our families, our jobs, or culturally. Then the antidote often seems to be this Senex quality of stiffened, rigid kinds of categories. And can we be curious? Can we be inclusive? Can we do what you mentioned before that Jung did, which was listen to all the voices? It doesn't hurt to listen and then reflect and then decide.
So Jung writes, the most dangerous revolutionary is within ourselves.
Whoa.
And all must realize this who wish to pass over safely into the second half of life. Certainly this means exchanging the apparent security we have so far enjoyed for a condition of insecurity, internal division, of contradictory convictions. The worst fear of all is that there appears to be no way out of this condition. There, in fact, is no middle way that allows us to trot forward without some form of change process that expands our inner landscape, that allows us into a more perfect union of the innumerable parts of ourselves, the seemingly competing instincts, thoughts, values, and accommodations, that the democratic process where we sublimate the outer war into vigorous political debate is the thing that we need both internally and externally. That it's okay for politicians to stand on the stumps and rail for one value or another value, and for all of us to even project our internal conflict into these two people that are taking representative positions and cheer that on as a kind of war of ideas that can happen in a certain political arena, so that we don't have to literalize this tension and then see people being swept up into mass shootings, which right now are very much in the news in the United States, or terrible repressive actions that are currently surging in various nation states around the world.
I'm landing on the word you used about a change process. And I'm thinking, I think it's a Buddhist precept that the only thing that we can really count on is that change will occur. And I think we know that. The question is, change is happening, will happen, will always happen. What kind of change do we choose? Do we want a violent kind of revolution? Do we want outer war? Do we want vigorous debate within a political arena? And I love that term arena because it is a containing word. We're going to have change. What kind of change can we choose and be in choice rather than just having it happen seemingly unwittingly and beyond our grasp?
And Jung's thoughtful consideration about how tension can lead to a new thing that does not diminish either value, but brings them together in a new and unprecedented way, which is the creation of the stone of the wise, is always possible, both in the individual and in the culture. Perhaps with that, we can go to the wisdom of a dream.
Did you know your dreams reveal the wisdom of your guiding self? Dreams connect us to the secret world within and remind us that we're never alone. We're always accompanied by our inner companion who offers healing, balance, insight, and guidance as we make key decisions. At 28, Charles felt lost and isolated. He had a dream that touched him deeply. As he worked with the dream in dream school, he understood that it was showing him how he was profoundly connected to life. This powerful insight led him to make real progress with his goals. During Dream School's 12-month transformational program, you'll learn to harness the power of your unconscious wisdom, decode the language of metaphor and symbol, discover mythological motifs that shape your life, reveal unknown facets of your personality, unlock the door to inner wisdom. To enroll, just go to interpretmydream.net and sign up today to gain immediate access to the first 3 Dream School modules. Your best life awaits you at Dream School, and we can't wait to see you there.
Today's dream is from a woman who is 47 years old. She's a legal assistant. And here's the dream. I am in some sort of tech office. Someone is here who is trying to steal data. My goal is to discover their identity, get the disk they are trying to smuggle, and get out. At one point, a female friend from church is standing across the room from me. She has a sniper rifle with a scope on it trained on me. I think maybe I can try to duck or run quickly behind something, but I know that I won't get there in time and she will shoot me. I am not sure what is going to happen. I also sense that she is friendly toward me. She may even be smiling, but she still has the sniper rifle trained on me. Then she is right in front of me. I take the barrel of the rifle and hold it up to my forehead and tell her it is okay. She can shoot me if she needs to. I close my eyes and am genuinely unsure of what is going to happen. Time passes. She decides not to shoot me after all. I am vaguely aware that there is a studio audience watching all of this, like it is a reality show or a game show of some kind, and I've won sympathy points by doing this. I don't have a reaction to this in the dream, but upon waking I find it annoying. The church friend has disappeared, and I continue looking for the infiltrator. I see a guy I noticed earlier and think, it can't possibly be him, that would be too easy. But then I see he has a CD under the cushion of his seat. It is him. When he is not looking, I retrieve the CD. I'm very nervous to do this, but I do not get caught. Now I need to get out of the building with the CD, but the sense of terror is gone. I am sure he is not going to catch me, and I can probably leave as I please. I am weirdly sad that the sense of apprehension is gone. For context, she says, I had this dream the night before my birthday. I've been wanting to move from my current job, which provides stability and security, to a more artistic life path. I don't know how to do this, and I am very frustrated. The main feelings in the dream, she says, were a sense of adventure at the beginning, no recalled affect when the rifle was trained on me, significant apprehension when I had to take the data disk, and disappointment when the goal had been achieved. She also adds that she has no association with tech companies. The woman with the sniper rifle in the dream is a truly lovely person to whom she feels very warmly. The sniper rifle, she says, when I play video games, I prefer to use a sniper rifle if possible. I can shoot opponents at a distance while I'm hidden. So here is a short story of a dream for us to explore and try to come to a better understanding.
Well, I really like this dream, and I have a few initial thoughts. One is that I imagine it is related to the dreamer's work life because it starts in an office. And the main action of the dream seems to revolve around this kind of image of work-related stuff with a kind of CD and that sort of thing. Interestingly, has a female figure and a male figure in the dream. And according to a classical Jungian understanding of the dream, we might imagine that the female figure is a shadow figure and the male figure is the animus. And in this case, I think that that probably works. The male figure, the animus, has the secret information that she needs. So perhaps it's this information about how she can change her work life to be more in line with what she really desires. And it is held by the animus. And he is actually making it easy for her to take it. And then there's this wonderful interaction she has with the shadow. I wish that I had a sense of how this woman, this church friend, is a shadow figure. If this dreamer were here, I would ask her, does anything bother you about this person? My guess is no, because she says feels very warmly toward this person. Another way to get at that same content, though, is to say, what about this person makes you feel jealous? And I suspect that she would have an answer to that. And that would tell us what the shadow content is that's being pictured by this church friend. In any case, it's so interesting that sniper rifles, as the dreamer points out, are good for distance so that you can hide and use your aggression in this kind of hidden way. But that's not what happens in the dream. The barrel of the gun is pointed right at her forehead. It isn't a long distance. She's not being taken out by a distance by an unseen sniper. But she has the right attitude toward the shadow content. She says, I'm not going to run. I'm not going to put up a fight. You do with me what you will. I'm ready to be penetrated by this unconscious content, which works out well for her, as it usually does in fairy tales, when we sort of surrender to the right thing, that she doesn't get shot. And in fact, it is then when she can so clearly see this CD of secret information that she needs.
You know, I had a thought about the shadow figure of the friend from the church. And I wonder if it may have something to do with a very ambivalent relationship with aggression. That at the beginning of the dream, someone is trying to steal data, and she needs to steal it. And then there is the interaction with the shadow figure with the sniper rifle. So is stealing data, that's aggressive. Aiming a rifle, that's aggressive. Finally, at the end, when she's very nervous about snitching the CD, that's aggressive. And I wonder if this friend of hers from church, who is particularly lovely, kind, and warm, needed to afford our dream ego a display of aggression. Not only this nice, warm, and presumably religious orientation, but some real opposition and aggression. So that, anyway, I'm I think repeating myself some, but I wonder about our dreamer's relationship with taking what she needs and being a straight shooter.
Yeah.
Well, I can see that's in the dream as well. I found myself focusing on the idea that there is data that is consciously accessible, and something in the psyche wants to take that away, which means it would then no longer be available. So I think we're talking about this process of repression and dissociation and something being taken away from a relationship with the ego, and that there's a concern that she senses something is going to be taken, and then she will no longer know, quote unquote, the information that she previously had access to or could have access to. And that the repressing part of her psyche is associated with religion. So she has a rifle that is trained on me. So I find myself thinking about the kind of repressive training, religious training, that's part of our childhood, most of us, and perhaps if we're still participating in a religious organization that is particularly repressive, that's being reinforced. Often, religious repression of instinctive forces is potentiated with various threats. You'll go to hell, God might even strike you dead, that there's this anxious threat about whether or not you are permitted to have some knowledge of yourself in your hand. Often this has to do with sexual repression, but there could be any number of transgressions that are not permitted. Marvelously in the dream, she is determined not to allow the unconscious to take something from her, take something away from her ability to know and to be aware. I really agree with you that she takes the barrel of the gun, she puts it up to her head, so she's overcome her fear of the defenses that are trying to make her unconscious about something, and in that moment, she depotentiates it. As often happens when we turn around and face the monster chasing us in a nightmare, all of a sudden the monster looks at us bewildered, that we've turned to face it. And often it has a piece of information that we don't want to know, or it's trying to prevent us from knowing something. It's scaring us away from a content. So the fear element of it has been triumphed over, which is enormous. I mean, that's a triumph in the dream. I think it's important that the secret is underneath the man's seat. This makes me think about the Iron John story, which is framed from the other side, that the key that the boy needs is under his mother's pillow. So the CD is underneath the father or the male's cushion, that something is being held, perhaps in her projections on the father principle or the masculine, and that she, as both of you had said, needs to retrieve something for herself from underneath the masculine complex. And she needs to do this with some cunning, much like the boy in Iron John. Needs to slip in and have a little crafty energy, so it's not a war, but it's the key or the CD or the secret information that's being kept from her. Requires the ego to kind of transgress the rules inside the psyche a bit. Now, we don't know what's on the CD that could be valuable to her, but as she says beautifully, the sense of terror is gone, which means that she can have a relationship ostensibly with both the shadow figure of the woman with the rifle, as well as the inner masculine, or what aspect of the masculine he represents, as well as reading the content of the CD.
I have a slightly different sense of tracking the affect in this dream, because the dreamer says that she didn't have any recalled affect when the rifle was trained on her by the shadow figure. And she also says that there was a sense of adventure at the beginning. So there is some sense that I have here, and the dream just tells us, the dream itself tells us what's going on, of that there's an adventure and that there's this confrontation with the shadow figure and the rifle is minus the kind of terror or fear that one might think. So I have a hunch here that it may be that this is an old construct in our dreamer that doesn't really have all that much energy in it anymore, because we could have a dream where the dream ego was terrified, where it might make sense to run away, where it might make sense to try to grab the rifle, it might make sense to do something else. But the dream itself says this is a kind of artificial content because right after that, she says, I'm vaguely aware there's a studio audience. And so this is as if. It's as if this is a play. It's as if this is an enactment of something that doesn't really hold genuine energy anymore. What does hold energy for our dream ego is how scared she is about retrieving the CD from under the animus figure's seat, and that is the real transgression. And when she does that, the sense of terror is gone.
Deb, I really like that. And I think it fits in with the way I'm seeing the dream. And I think I'm really struck also by the fact that she's weirdly sad that the sense of apprehension is gone, that the adventure's over. And again, Joseph, I do think I'm seeing this a little bit differently than you. I see the information on the CD is the secret. It's the boon. It is the purpose of the quest. And the ego thinks that the male figure is kind of stealing it, but really he's kind of making it available to her, and her task is to take it from him. And Deb, I like what you said about aggression. She needs to be the one to steal it. And I wonder if what's on the CD is sort of comparable in some way to this information about how to switch her career over to be more artistic. Then it's almost like she doesn't want that information yet, because it's kind of exciting to be contemplating something transgressive like that. But once you kind of get down to brass tacks and you figure out how to do it, then it is likely going to not be very romantic or dramatic. It's likely just going to be a lot of hard work. And I wonder if her sense of sadness at the end of it is, once she figures out how to make this switch, when she takes conscious responsibility for it, it won't feel like a grand adventure. It's going to feel much more like a slog.
Right. It won't feel like a game show either.
So I guess my feeling is a little different in as much as in the beginning, she's in a tech office and the data is already known, that it's not a secret, it's readily available to her and the rest of the psyche. So she might retrieve the CD and then be curious about what the content was that the unconscious was so determined to make unconscious or to keep from her. So that could be, I guess, a secret in as much as anyone who works in a tech office has a massive amounts of data that they're clearly not reading everything. They're actually just librarians or curators of an enormous amount of data. She might, but she doesn't say it, become curious about this particular data and why that of all things had to be stolen and stuffed in the unconscious. So it could be that it represents something particularly ego-dystonic or provocative or problematic to the rest of the psyche. So in that way, I suppose there is something for her to know about on the CD, although I'm not sure whether she has a sense that she's simply going to restore the CD back into the database at the beginning, or whether it's going to have any individual value for her.
You know, I have a hunch in a way that the CD is in a way another red herring. So I'm feeling very sort of Nancy Drew-like here for the moment, because what she says is she's nervous about stealing the CD. And then she says, I need to get out of the building with the CD. So our dream starts in an office, and now she needs to get out of the building. So sense of terror is gone. I'm sure he is not going to catch me, and I can probably leave as I please. She's free to go. She doesn't need to be in the office. She doesn't even need to be in the building. She's free to make her life transition or career transition or do with herself and her life as she pleases. And the sense of apprehension that she's weirdly missing, that's right, it's gone, because that is a false sense of apprehension. And now you have to go forth and make your choices.
So at the end, she's kind of weirdly disappointed that the sense of adventure is how I would phrase it, that she's been on an exciting quest. And there's 3 goals, just like any other kind of great quest. One is to discover the identity, to retrieve the lost thing, and then to get out. So one of the things that she's saying in the context is she wants to find a way to get out of her old job. But here there's this issue of learning about her own identity by discovering the identity of other parts of herself, to expand her own sense of identity, as well as to retrieve something that was lost, and then to get out, to move on. And we could say those are broad analytic tasks. Expand identity, retrieve the things that are lost, and then move on. So, and this has been provided by the Dream Maker as a particularly personalized theme of this heroic retrieval. And of course, the things that are lost this is where we would need to work with a client. The things that we lose by the time we become 47 are substantial. Lose touch with.
A really interesting dream.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.